A few days before 300 or more students at Burton Academy walked out of class for 17 minutes to demonstrate support for the students slain in a shooting rampage at a Florida high school on February 14th, we had a chance to conduct an interview with 3 of the local students who helped organize the walkout at BBA, which was part of a broader series of walkouts held at many high schools across the country. Some viewers may have seen a few minutes of this discussion in an earlier report we produced about the walkout, which took place at Burton on Monday, March 19th. But we thought this discussion was illuminating enough to warrant a fuller presentation, which we have edited lightly but gives a broader perspective on some of the students' concerns and motivations around the issues of guns and school safety.
Well, I guess for me it all kind of really started with Sandy Hook, because I remember so vividly like where I was as in middle school and hearing about that, and then like we've talked about, expecting that there would be a response to that, and I remember the moments of silence, and I remember all the overtures about starting some sort of legislation for that, and how that never really happened, and then everyone forgot about it, and it almost felt like the country was okay with that, like it was a reasonable sacrifice to make, and I just could not subscribe to that point of view at all. So then, 4 years go by, some of the biggest mass shootings in American history, almost all of them probably have happened in the past 4 years, with Orlando, Las Vegas, and then in this past shooting in Parkland, I think it was really that the victims of the shootings themselves could speak out so eloquently so articulately about this issue, and that is something, like they've said themselves, the students at Sandy Hook were just too young to have that moral authority, and those students really had it, and they spoke, they said something that I think that a lot of students feel, and I think adults a lot of the time underestimate how much students think about getting shot in school, which is really horrifying, and I haven't met a student who hasn't thought about that before happening at this school. So that was sort of where it all started, is we felt like this was something that adults really underestimated how much students thought about or worried about, and the country or the government was sort of abdicating their responsibility to protect students in that way. And then we kind of felt like that was widely felt by a lot of people at our school.
Yeah, and where the Parkland shooting was able to get such a mass message out there, I believe, is that because they took this tragedy, this horrific event that never should have happened but did happen to them, and they were able to use their unfortunate position in that to and their place in the national spotlight due to the news, to try and push out legislation and push out their agenda and push out the message that this can't happen again. And now that, as Tyler said, that they are teenagers, they are fully fledged teenagers with minds and thoughts and an ability to speak about the issues that matter to them and the issues that matter to others. They've been able to gather up a huge amount of our entire generation into this message, which is such an incredible thing, to have a good part of this entire age group of students completely united for this one issue across the country.
I really think Katie and Tyler said it perfectly, but I was really inspired by the Parkland High School students and their ability to not just mourn the loss of their fellow classmates, but to use their anger to ignite this whole movement that's happening around the country. And specifically, like, why we chose to organize this, I think a really important piece was not letting the flame die out. Like, after watching their speeches basically go viral on social media, and the march that they're also planning in DC, that's all been organized by them, has been something really inspiring to us, and just bringing that back to our communities and being the ones that are bringing this to the Manchester community, because there is a lot that we can do as students as BBA, as they said. But yeah, I think that's the biggest piece of it, is that just looking at what they're doing and saying they're just like us, they're the same age as us, and the platform that they're using, and using the message that they're sharing, and really bringing that back to Vermont and our fellow students.
We were struck by the comment that many students think about being in school when a shooting incident occurs, and probed a bit further about that.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, like I said, it would be really hard to find a student who wouldn't agree with that sentiment. Mm-hmm. That basically every student I've ever discussed this with has said, like, you know, I think about that happening here, or like, it would be so easy during this time of day, like in that sort of visceral like imagery they think about. And I wrote an article for the Manchester Journal, and I kind of started it off by saying, like, this is the time of day when the shooting in Florida happened. This is where I would have been, and it could so easily happen here. And I think that's like another thing that spurred the walkout is like, no one's going to solve this for us. That's what we've seen the last 20 years is that, you know, we've just been having the same conversation over and over again as a country. And if nothing happens, someone will die. Like, it may not be us, but somebody will, probably someone our age.
We then turn to discuss the goals and purposes of the planned walkout set for the following week.
Yes, the goal of the walkout is to raise awareness for the issue, but that's just one of the many, and I feel like the more nuanced goals are within the common sense gun reform that we're all pushing for across the country, and the specific specificities of what exactly common sense gun reform is, because that varies between so many different people. And personally, we believe it's a mandatory waiting period for buying after filing to buy a gun for the first time. It is a comprehensive universal background check that is actually universal and does become united across the on the national scale, because since the passage of the Brady Bill, when Reagan was shot, which was supposed to push across universal background checks, states have been able to kind of just circumvent these laws and really make their background check systems on their own state basis, which in a lot of states isn't really anything at all.
I think one of our major goals is to really bring awareness to the lack of action, and as Tyler was talking about earlier, how a lot of our legislators are more focusing on talking it out, and even in a past article, our education secretary actually came out against the walkouts and was encouraging students and administrations of Vermont schools to have students have dialogue. And I really think the purpose of this walkout is to show that we're done talking it out, and that we are really waiting for a response from our legislators, the people that can actually make action, not only within our own states, but across the country. And I think Vermont is actually in a really special situation in terms of gun regulations, because we have notoriously been a state that has very weak gun regulations. Obviously, states that already have strict gun regulations are already doing everything that they can to push the agendas that they agree with, but Vermont, as we historically don't have the strongest gun regulations, are in a spot where we can change the game, I guess, or even out the playing field if we decide to really listen to these student voices and listen to the way that the country's moving in terms of gun regulations. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think what I would like on a national scale is something similar to the federal assault weapons ban that existed, I think, from 1994 to 2004, and then wasn't renewed. That would have been, the semi-automatic rifles that were used in so many of these mass shootings over and over again. And that doesn't apply to every gun, but it's just those that can just take as many lives in such a short period of time so as to make like an armed response to it almost like futile. And I think taking those weapons don't belong in civilian society, in my opinion. And I will say that I think there are policy differences in terms of all the students who are planning on walking out on Monday, but all of them agree that just the lack of an action is the worst part of this. But for me, that would be the ideal policy.
Yeah, and it's a lot of schools throughout the country who haven't really gotten 100% on board with the walkout idea have tried to do these things called walk up, which is rather than going outside and peacefully protesting for 17 minutes, you go up to 17 kids who you don't normally talk to and say hi. And I believe that this kind of system that they're trying to put in place, rather than letting their students exercise their First Amendment right to protest, is completely just blaming the students who are the potential victims or who are the past victims of school shootings for not being nice enough, for apparently bullying the shooter, rather than blaming the person who perpetrated a mass shooting. And it's just perpetuating the cycle of victim blaming in this country, and that is not the case. We need to have comprehensive gun reform to make sure that people who could be mass shooters aren't anymore.
And what about other students at school who may not be on board with the idea of a walkout? or of strengthening gun laws.
So I've actually had a couple conversations with people because I do have a lot of friends that are not necessarily against gun regulation reform, but definitely against the walkout and the march that's happening next weekend. And not very surprisingly, the conversation hasn't lasted very long because they aren't willing to talk about it as much. I think that especially in Vermont, with so many different opinions on this issue, people are kind of closed off and not very open-minded in terms of, even with all of the school shootings that have been happening in the past 20 years, their eyes still haven't been open to the implications that not placing proper regulations on guns are having in this country. And I get we're high school students and that isn't always a pressing issue on our mind, but I think the purpose of this walkout and making this such a big deal in our community is that it should be. And we really need to think about all the implications before shutting off the other side. And I guess that does go back to having dialogue, but it's a lot bigger issue, and it's hard to talk to students because they are so caught up in their own lives. And that's what I've had experience with.
The students gave credit to the school's administration for being supportive of what they were trying to do and described the discussions with school officials that preceded the event.
So I was actually really impressed with our school's response because the Secretary of Education, Rebecca Holcomb, released this memo to all schools saying that they should be cautious of a walkout, probably not support it. And our school really, pushed back against that idea. We did initially encounter like some, hesitance because they wanted to make sure that we did it in a way that was organized and not just, a mob of students walking out. But I think, so we had a meeting that anyone was invited to during, like an office hours block of our school. And a lot of students went out, and the meeting did show that was the first moment that I really realized how universal this feeling was. And although we didn't accomplish a plan during that meeting, it sort of led to us realizing like, okay, we have to stand up, make sure this is organized, because this has to happen. And then after that, it became clear that our administrators just wanted to make sure that students were organized and that this was student-led. And once they saw that we were willing to, provide some leadership for that and organize the students in a cohesive way and make some sort of statement that was, universal, they were willing to jump on board with that. And they did see it as a school issue. So they actively, they didn't support, they didn't want to show, complete support for every idea, I guess, but they were really willing to facilitate us and allow us to do what we needed to do. So I'm really happy that our school isn't taking disciplinary action against any student who's participating peacefully.
It's been very clear from the beginning too. And going off what Tyler said with the meeting, so the administration actually organized this meeting right the week after the events in Parkland, and it wasn't necessarily to talk specifically about the walkout, but because of all this passion and drive and people were hearing that other schools were planning to walk out, it shifted the conversation a little bit to students talking about this. And a couple days after that, we actually went up to Montpelier to listen to our senators talking about the amendment to S6 in terms of providing background checks on the transfer of weapons. So that was a really cool experience for students to really witness that in action. And on the bus ride home was actually when we had one of our biggest conversations in planning, like, hey, this is going to be happening, what do we want to see? And it was a ton of people that had already gone to that meeting, and that's when we also had the idea to have the 17 minutes of silence, which, because our first thought was, okay, we're going to plan this walkout, but what are we going to do for 17 minutes? Because every single school was kind of coming up with their own plans, although there was a lot of overlap. But I think the emphasis on silence is something that's really important, and not only mourning the loss of all these victims that have happened in school shootings, but also the idea that we are done talking, and the unified stance of silence is something that's really, really powerful, and I'm excited to see how it goes.
Yeah, and out of, I believe it's around 721 students that go to BBA right now, I think it's just under 300 students have already pre-registered for the walkout, and we believe a few more are going to come along anyway on the day with, which really shows how passionate the BBA community is. towards making this walkout actually happen and believing in this issue and believing in the action that has to come about because of it.
Then it was on to next steps. 2 busloads of students and their supporters are planning to attend a rally in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, March 24th.
Well, the walkout has put us in touch with a lot of local organizations such as Move On Manchester, and a bunch of other liberal organizations. Although I will say this issue is not just for us, but in a partisan issue. It's for any politician or any person who supports common sense gun reform, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the Democratic Party. But I think from here, the walkout's just the beginning. We need our goal is to change legislation. The state level is the first step. We hope to be part of the national movement to change legislation in the United States Congress. If that can't happen, then I think the ultimate goal of the walkout is to register students to ensure that they vote, that their voice is heard. It's the only way for their voice really to be heard, for things to change in Washington. So the way to keep this issue in the national conversation and to make sure that this changes is if people vote and if students vote. So I think, yes, a huge part of the walkout is just to show that we are willing to keep pushing for this legislation, but it's also to get students to register to vote, to get students involved in politics.
Yeah, and another part of that is making a statement through sheer numbers, because I know this walkout is happening with almost half of the BBA student population. It's happening all across the state, it's happening all across the country, and once we show our legislators on all levels of government that we care and we're not going away, we believe that that will spur them to make change on their respective level. And furthermore, we want all of these kids who have registered and are going to participate in the walkout to not stop being involved in politics like this. We want to galvanize them towards action, whether it be just calling their senators, just like sending a letter to their legislators, voting like Tyler mentioned, pretty much anything they can do to keep this political process going.
Yeah,
Have you got any? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I just think there's a couple different pieces of this. So as Katie was saying, how students should not stop, and I think that it's really important, not only with this issue, but for high schools really to promote student advocacy like as a whole. And I think that's a shift that we're slowly making an effort towards, because in the past, like especially the issue of like talking it out, I think that students should be encouraged actually how to use this information that they're receiving about like the world around us and actually use that to take action. So that walkout's a perfect example of doing that, and not just at the state level in terms of passing legislation, but also little things within our community. For example, the Riley Rink Board, how they recently came out and said that they weren't allowing the gun show to happen at Riley Rink anymore. Little things like that are really important and are the next step that we can do on a local level, because obviously at a state level there isn't much direct action that we have other than lobbying our legislatures and keeping this movement going and keeping our voices heard.
We asked if they'd been in touch with local and state representatives to see what might be doable in terms of legislation in Vermont.
I have actually, I talked to Brian Campion a couple weeks ago about this issue because he was at a Vermont Democrats, Manchester Democrats meeting, and I was there as well. And I'm glad that we've seen the support from him that we have. If that ever changed, of course, we would be upset about that. We would push very hard for this legislation to pass through the Vermont House, the Vermont Senate, and I think that's going to remain the same. I mean, I think our step after this is really to take this to the State House. Anything that we accomplish locally, after we accomplish anything locally that we can.
Yeah, and while we haven't had any direct conversation with other members of the state government or any level of government yet, with the visit to the State House that Cece and I went on that she talked about earlier, we got to hear a lot of the debate that was going on about adding the Essex bill to the S55 bill, basically making it more of an issue and bringing it almost ready to vote. And there was a lot of surprising debate on this, and it seemed very, very repetitive in the way that they were debating. It seemed like they were in such a stalemate, basically. Like, it was really cool to see all of this lawmaking process in action, but at the same time it felt like they were getting nothing done based on the fact that they were two sides completely not compromising to the other. One said, I absolutely need my guns, we need to be able to do what we want with our guns, and our government shouldn't do anything outside of what they're doing already. And then the other side saying that no, we need more comprehensive gun legislation, we need to add background checks to the gun show loophole and to private sales, we need to not make it so you can sell a gun, I think, in a Five Guys parking lot in South Burlington that they mentioned that happened. You can't just stroll up to a random guy, he asks for your ID, you say, do I have to, and he just sells you an AR-15 in a Five Guys parking lot. We need to make it so things like that can't happen, and we need to make it so that if someone is perceived to be a threat, the government is able to take away their guns for a set period of time until the threat is examined, investigated, and made sure to be figured out to be actually a threat or not a threat at all. And those two sides just seem to be so set in stone during this debate, with pretty much everyone standing up, saying their opinion, and sitting back down again, and not really having any sort of compromise between the sides.
Yeah, and that exact point is exactly why we need fresh voices, student voices, and I think that's so important of why we are a part of this conversation, and just the fact that we can't let them forget that we are a part of this conversation too, and that the voters are a part of this conversation too, and that we need to establish a very visible presence in this conversation. I think that is the most important next step. So.
We asked what they were anticipating happening at school immediately after the walkout, when everyone returned to class.
Oh, I definitely think there will be discussions in classrooms. I know that a lot of teachers are definitely fascinated by the whole walkout and everything that's going on, and I can't guarantee all teachers, but I already know even my math teacher has came up to me and has been asking me questions about the walkout and how it's being organized and what effect that what students are saying about these issues. So I think that student-teacher communication is also a really important part of this, since there is that age gap, but not necessarily a knowledge gap in terms of issues, not all the time. So.
Mm-hmm. And then of course there's the march. Just 6 days after the walkout, our walkout on Monday, and we're organizing 2 buses to go down, bringing around 75 students. So that will be the next step for us in terms of making our voices heard around this issue. If there's one other thing we should I think obviously say, is that I think all of us were really disappointed in the Secretary of Education's decision to come out against this. Mm-hmm. And the arguments they used was, first of all, if a school supported this issue, what's next to come? Will some more odious group of some political advocacy group try and pass their own walkout under this precedent? And I think that's just completely ridiculous, because this is a school issue. It'd be the same as if we had a walkout for school choice, which our school is very partisan on. It's an issue that has to do with schools. It'd be very different if we had a walkout about something that wasn't directly related to schools, say if we all walked out for healthcare. I guess maybe that would be different. But this is a school issue, and we're all a part of that, and we're really happy that our school had the same point of view on that memo that we did.
Yeah, and I guess we also just have to ask the adults in the community and everybody else who isn't directly related to this in-school walkout to support us, just basically in trying to get our voices heard, because we're students and we're dismissed a lot because we're young and we are still emotional. But as all of the Parkland survivors have said in their speeches, that is one of our strengths, and that is our strength in that we will not give up, and all we're asking for is the support of the adults in our journey to try to change legislation for the better.
They added there was no overarching network of student leaders spreading out beyond Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, where the February 14th shooting rampage occurred. Rather, the organization was local.
There's not really an overarching point of view. I remember I saw something funny online where they were criticizing right-wing sort of commentators who had said that the left is organizing students, but the real story is that the students are organizing the left, and I think that's really the case. This is a grassroots movement. We haven't had any communication with other schools. I think I know just personally, I know some friends of mine at other like Rutland High School who have organized similar movements, but there hasn't really been that much coordination between schools. It's really just come from the bottom up.
Exactly, yeah. And I feel like social media has also played a huge part in this because people are sharing so many different sorts of posts. I mean, I know that gearing up to the walkout, at least I found out that there was this set national walkout at 10 a.m., 17 minutes for each of the 17 lives lost in Parkland. The way that I found out about that was through just posts shared on social media and all of these people from other schools and our schools pledging their support to the cause. And I was like, all right, let's do this.
Yeah, but I think most schools across the country have all dealt with this a little bit differently.
Yeah.
Like there hasn't been one sort of set narrative or like script that anyone's been following. Some schools aren't doing 17 minutes of silence. Some schools are having an assembly, but I think like for us, we decided that this was the best way to show that we weren't gonna stand for inaction anymore.
And as many of you know, the walkout at BBA occurred peacefully on Monday, March 19th, with the students returning to class after it ended. We want to thank the 3 students for sharing their time and views, and hope to continue this discussion as well. For the GNet TV News Project, I'm Andrew McKeever.